From the moment the first German panzers crossed the Polish border in 1939, the world witnessed a military machine of terrifying efficiency. The Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, seemed unstoppable. Poland fell in weeks, France in a matter of months. By the summer of 1941, the Nazi swastika flew from the North Cape of Norway to the shores of the Greek Peloponnese. The German war machine appeared invincible, a juggernaut destined to forge a thousand-year Reich. And yet, just under 6 years later, that same machine lay in utter ruins, its cities bombed to rubble, its army shattered, its leadership dead by suicide or awaiting trial for crimes against humanity. This is not merely the story of how Germany lost the Second World War. This is the story of why, from the very beginning, Germany could never have won. It is a story of strategic blindness, economic folly, and ideological poison that doomed the Nazi project from its inception. The seeds of Germany's ultimate defeat were sown long before the first shot was fired. They were embedded in the very nature of the Nazi state. Adolf Hitler's regime was not a rational, calculating government in the traditional sense. It was a chaotic, faction-ridden system built around the cult of a single infallible leader. This leadership principle, the Führerprinzip, meant that strategic and economic decisions were often made based on Hitler's intuition, his ideological obsessions, or the outcome of internal power struggles rather than cold, hard military logic. Key ministries and branches of the armed services competed for resources and Hitler's favor, leading to disastrous inefficiencies. The German economy itself, despite its fearsome reputation, was fundamentally unprepared for a long total war. Hitler, fearing domestic discontent, had delayed shifting the economy to a full war footing until 1942, when the brilliant but ruthless Albert Speer took over armaments production. For the first 3 years of the conflict, German consumer production remained curiously high. This was in stark contrast to Britain, which had mobilized its economy completely by 1941, and the Soviet Union, which had moved its entire industrial base east of the Ural Mountains, out of the reach of German bombers. From the start, Germany was trying to win a sprint against opponents preparing for a marathon.
Germany's first and perhaps most fatal strategic error was its failure to achieve its primary stated objective, the subjugation of Great Britain. The victory in France was so swift it left even the German high command stunned. But the British Expeditionary Force, though defeated, had escaped at Dunkirk. With the British Isles refusing to surrender, Hitler was faced with a problem he had not seriously planned for. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, was a risky proposition that required one non-negotiable precondition: air superiority over the English Channel. Thus began the Battle of Britain, a clash not of armies, but of air forces. The German Luftwaffe, designed as a tactical weapon to support the army, was ill-suited for the strategic bombing campaign required to break the Royal Air Force. A critical mistake was the shift in targeting from RAF airfields and radar stations to British cities, the Blitz. This gave the battered fighter command a crucial respite to recover. The few of the RAF, bolstered by pilots from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Canada, and beyond, held the line. By denying Germany air superiority, they ensured that the invasion barges never sailed. Britain remained an unsinkable aircraft carrier, a base for future offensives and a beacon of defiance. The failure to neutralize Britain meant Germany now faced a persistent and growing threat on its western flank, a threat that would later open a second front and provide a vital logistics hub for the immense American war machine. If the failure against Britain was a critical setback, the decision to invade the Soviet Union was the single greatest strategic blunder of the war, the one from which recovery was impossible. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, was a gamble of epic proportions, born from Hitler's core ideological belief in Lebensraum, living space in the East. It immediately created the two-front war that German strategists had feared for a century. The initial invasion was devastating, with millions of Soviet soldiers captured in massive encirclements. But the German plan was fatally flawed. It was based on arrogant assumptions that the Soviet state was a rotten structure that would collapse with one sharp kick, and that the campaign could be concluded in a matter of months before the onset of winter. They were wrong on both counts.
The vastness of the Soviet Union, its seemingly limitless reserves of manpower, and the ruthless determination of the Stalinist regime to fight a total war all conspired against the German invaders. The critical delay of a few weeks, caused by the need to subdue Yugoslavia and Greece, now proved costly. The German advance stalled in the frozen mud and then the sub-zero temperatures of the Russian winter, just short of Moscow. The Wehrmacht, unprepared for winter warfare, suffered terribly. The myth of German invincibility was shattered in the snows outside the Soviet capital. The war in the East would not be a swift blitzkrieg. It was to become a war of attrition, a Vernichtungskrieg, or war of annihilation that would grind down the German army day by bloody day.
Just as the campaign in Russia was reaching its crisis point, Hitler compounded his strategic failures by making another. On December 11, 1941, 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he declared war on the United States of America. There was no treaty obligation that forced him to do so. The tripartite pact with Japan was a defensive one. It was a decision of staggering folly. With a single speech, Hitler solved Franklin D. Roosevelt's great political problem: how to enter the war in Europe against Nazi Germany. The United States, with its population of 130 million and its colossal industrial potential, was now a formal belligerent. The arsenal of democracy would now be turned against the Third Reich with full force. American factories, safe from bombing across an ocean, began churning out a staggering volume of war material. Ships, planes, tanks, and trucks at a rate Germany could never hope to match. In 1943, for example, the United States produced over 86,000 tanks compared to Germany's 17,000. This economic disparity was insurmountable. Germany had now willingly taken on a coalition of the world's 3 greatest industrial powers: the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States. It was an economic and demographic mismatch that no amount of tactical brilliance or soldierly courage could overcome. The war was not only won on the battlefield, it was won in the secret laboratories, the code-breaking rooms, and the factories. And in this hidden war, Germany was consistently outmatched. While it produced wonder weapons like the V-2 rocket and the first jet fighter, the MiG-262, these were often too late, too few, or misallocated due to Hitler's interference. The Allies, however, excelled at the integration of technology and intelligence. The British, with the help of Polish mathematicians, cracked the German Enigma code, a secret source of intelligence known as Ultra. This provided the Allies with an often decisive insight into German plans and movements. Similarly, the Americans broke Japanese naval codes, leading to the victory at Midway. On the technological front, the Allies developed and mass-produced technologies that gave them a critical edge. The cavity magnetron, a key component of centimetric radar, made Allied anti-submarine warfare and night bombing devastatingly effective. The proximity fuse, used in anti-aircraft shells, decimated German aircraft, and later V-1 flying bombs. Germany, for all its engineering genius, failed to coordinate its scientific efforts effectively or to translate prototypes into mass-produced, war-winning weapon systems before it was too late. Perhaps the most damning and morally repugnant reason for Germany's failure was the ideology that drove the Nazi state itself. The racist core of Nazism was not just a sidebar to the war. It was a central factor in its execution and its ultimate loss. From the beginning, the war in the East was conceived as a war of extermination. The Commissar Order and the Barbarossa Decree effectively legalized murder, encouraging brutal treatment of Soviet prisoners of war and civilians. This was not merely brutality, it was policy. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, required immense logistical resources, railway cars, personnel, and bureaucratic organization that could have been directed toward the war effort. But more pragmatically, the policy of terror and genocide in occupied territories was a catastrophic strategic failure.
Initially, some in Ukraine and the Baltic states welcomed the Germans as liberators from Stalinist oppression. This goodwill was squandered almost instantly by a regime that viewed all Slavs as Untermenschen, or subhumans, fit only for slave labor. This created a bitter and determined partisan movement behind the German lines, tying down hundreds of thousands of security troops. Had Germany pursued a policy of liberation rather than extermination, they might have turned the Soviet population against Stalin and broken the Soviet will to resist. Instead, they unified the people behind the Red Banner, forging a desperate, patriotic defense of the motherland that ultimately pushed the Wehrmacht all the way back to Berlin. By the end of 1942, the fleeting opportunity for a German victory had vanished forever. The twin disasters at El Alamein in North Africa and Stalingrad on the Volga marked the irreversible turning of the tide. In Stalingrad, the entire German Sixth Army was encircled and destroyed, a loss of over 250,000 men that shocked the German people. From this point on, the initiative passed irrevocably to the Allies. The German army, though still a formidable and professional fighting force, was now in a perpetual state of retreat, bleeding itself white on two massive fronts. The war production of the Allies began to tell. American and British bombers pounded German cities by day and night in a relentless strategic bombing campaign that, while costly, crippled the German fuel supply and transportation network. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army, having learned brutal lessons, began a series of massive offensives that pushed the Germans back over 1,000 miles. The material superiority of the Allies was now overwhelming. On the ground, the Soviet T-34 tank was produced in the tens of thousands, outclassing and outnumbering German panzers. In the air, swarms of Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft and American P-51 Mustang long-range fighters cleared the skies. At sea, Allied convoys, protected by new technologies and broken codes, finally won the Battle of the Atlantic, ensuring the men and material could flow freely from the United States to the fronts.
As the walls closed in, the flaws in the German command structure became fatal. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality and distrustful of his professional generals, took ever tighter control of military operations. He issued no-retreat orders, forbidding his armies from making tactical withdrawals to more defensible positions. This led to entire armies being needlessly destroyed when they could have been saved to fight another day. The most famous example was the stand at Stalingrad, but the pattern repeated itself across the Eastern Front. His intuition, which had once seemed prescient, now led to one disaster after another. The last major German offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, was a desperate gamble that consumed the last of Germany's strategic reserves for no lasting gain. By 1945, Germany was fighting a ghost of its former self, with old men and young boys conscripted into the Volkssturm militia equipped with obsolete weapons. The industrial base was collapsing under the bombing campaign and the loss of key resource areas. The final battle for Berlin was not a strategic maneuver, but a nihilistic Gotterdammering orchestrated by a leader who would rather see his nation destroyed than admit defeat.
In the final analysis, Germany could not win World War II because it was fighting a war its own ideology and economic structure had made unwinnable. It was a war launched by a reckless leadership that systematically underestimated its opponents and overestimated its own capabilities. It was a war fought against a coalition whose combined economic and human resources dwarfed its own. It was a war whose conduct, poisoned by a genocidal ideology, alienated potential allies and hardened its enemies into an unyielding resolve. The tactical prowess of the German soldier and the early technological advantages of the Wehrmacht were real, but they were never enough to overcome these fundamental deficits. The Second World War was not lost in a single moment or a single battle. It was lost in the very blueprint of the Third Reich, a state built for conquest and aggression, but utterly incapable of building a lasting peace or winning a prolonged war against the world.
The Thousand-Year Reich lasted 12, leaving behind a legacy of unparalleled destruction and a lesson in the inevitable failure of hubris, hatred, and strategic folly.